Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is Technique Tuesday. One of my mantras is that there are always multiple ways of getting to the same endpoint in knitting. In this video, I'm going to show you variations of the knit front back increase and the make one increase that could improve your finished results, as well as show you how to swap the knit front back with the make one and vice versa. So let's get started. The first increase we're going to talk about is the knit front back increase. It's really the easiest increase there is. It's often the first one that knitters learn. In plain solid stockinette fabric like this, it is a visible increase. You can see the little bump. They look like purl bumps, so that can be seen as decorative, or it can be seen as annoying because you don't want something that obvious in your fabric. This increase can sometimes be absolutely invisible. So I'm going to show you how that's possible. Here I've got a little bit of ribbing. It's knit to purl to ribbing. And we're going to pretend this is a project where it starts with ribbing and then it's going to switch to stockinette or some other stitch pattern. So in the very last row of the ribbing, what I'm going to do is use a knit front back increase that will be invisible. So I'm going to do that increase somewhere in the middle. I'm in a section now where there are 2 knit stitches. So I'm going to work the first knit stitch and I'm going to work the knit front back in the second one. So I'm always going to work the knit front back in a knit stitch that is adjacent to a purl stitch, so that it's followed by a purl stitch. So when I do my knit front back, I'm creating another knit stitch, and then I go into the back and I get that result that has the little bump below it, looks like a purl stitch, and I work my other 2 purl stitches. In ribbing fabric, the purls recede and the knits come forward. So I've got my new stitch here. It looks like I've got 3 purl stitches now, but in the context of the ribbing, it's really invisible, less visible than other types of increases would be. When we want to use knit front back increases in a situation like I have here with it's a solid color stockinette and I want things to be mirrored, I want them to be in very specific spots in the same position away from the edge, there's a little trick that you can use with the standard knit front back in order to get this. So I have 3 knit stitches, then the bump, I have the bump, and then 3 knit stitches. If that's what I want, then the way that I get that is I knit 2 stitches and then in the 3rd stitch I'm going to work my knit front back and that's going to put the bump to the left. But as I get to the end of the row, because that bar is always to the left, in order for me to get that bar in this position, 3 stitches away from the edge, I have to work the knit front back in the 4th stitch from the edge so that I will get that bump in the correct place. And that works really well in most situations. You just have to give a little thought ahead of time about where it is you want those increases to be and what it means in terms of which stitch you have to work it into. Raglan increases are often done using knit front back increases. And the way that's done is you have a stitch that is determined to be the seam line and you have the bumps on either side of it. And in order to have those bumps appear on either side, this seam line, the stitch before the seam line is worked as a knit front back, but then that seam line is worked as a knit front back in order to put that bump to the left. That can create this sort of big stitch, little stitch in that seam line here, which, you know, that's what happens when you work the knit front backs like this repeatedly. But there is a way that you can mirror the knit front back in a different way, and I'll show you how you can do that here. So I'm at the stitch before the seam line. So this is where the previous increase occurred, that you can see the bump. So I'm going to work this as a knit front back in order to create that bump. That was what was done every stitch before that. But instead of working this as a knit front back, I'm just going to knit it. And so now this time I'm going to work a mirror to the knit front back in that stitch that was created previously, where you can see the bump below the needle. So I have a full video on this, but this is a trick you can use. You slip as if to knit, return it, then you knit that stitch so that it twists. And then as that comes off the needle, you can see that twisted loop below the needle. You capture that front leg right here, and then you knit that. And that will create the bump to the right-hand side without causing this stitch to either enlarge or shrink. I'll do a few more rows so that you can see what it looks like after a few increases. I've done one more. This was the first one that I did, and then here's the second one. But you can see how that center column remains perfectly, the stitches remain all the same size instead of having that big, small result. So that's a situation where I'd actually use a mirror to a knit front back rather than mirroring it by planning that bump is going to be to the left. And that's in a very specific situation. Most of the time, it probably isn't worth trying to remember how to do that mirrored knit front back increase, and it's just easier to plan for where that bump is going to end up being. But those are some options. I want to mention here that there are a couple of other situations where a knit front back might be used and where it would be reasonably invisible. One would be if you were using dark or variegated yarn. A knit front back would be really difficult to see in either one of those situations. Another common place where knit front back increases are reasonably invisible is when you're doing mass increases, like doubling the number of stitches in a single row so that you're knit front back in every stitch. This is something that you might do, say, at the beginning of a top-down hat or in other projects that start with a very small number of stitches at the center of a circular item. The fabric is so gathered up at that point that knit front back increases won't be disruptive. Patterns will often switch to a different increase after that once the fabric has more rows and stitches. The make one increase, instead of being done in an existing stitch, is done between existing stitches. So if we look right here, we have these two columns of stitches right here, and then we see the make one increase, which is just a twisted loop at the base that becomes the base of the new column of stitches. So this is a really handy increase if you want to make sure that you have something that closely resembles the existing stitches and is not going to be raised above the surface. These come in right and left leaning. In this case, I have all the right leaning ones on the right edge and the left on the left edge. That's one way of doing it. And another way that tends to be my preference is to have the increases leaning toward the area that's changing in size. And so since the edges are always consistently 3 stitches and it's the center part that's getting larger, I usually prefer to have them leaning in the other direction. But that is just a preference, and as long as you're consistent, it doesn't matter. Now, one thing about make one increases is that in addition to having a right or left leaning one, there are really 3 different ways to create these make one increases. Let's see if I can point out the 3 different methods. So the first method is right here. The second method is here. And the third one is here. So they both are achieving a left-leaning increase. And I did them all in the same row, but what you'll notice is that this first one appears to be a row lower than the other 2. So let me show you how these can be done. So this is the one that you usually see in knitting patterns, where you lift the running thread between the 2 stitches that are on the needles. So you lift it up. And if I'm going to do a make one left, which is what I've been doing, I lift it up so that that is angled to the left, and then I knit it. Now I'm holding the yarn in my left hand, but if you were holding it in your right hand, you'd still just knit it. And then that creates that left leaning twist. So the next way that you can do it in is the way that I usually prefer to do it is to simply do a yarn over. And when you're holding the yarn in your left hand and you're doing a normal yarn over, you can see that the strand is lying to the left. And that's all you do. You just do a yarn over. And then the next type that you can do is to create a twisted loop on the needle. So if I'm holding the yarn in my left hand and I want a twisted loop, I have it over my finger and I come from the back and you can see that twisted left loop. And you can do this with the yarn in your right hand too. So you create the twisted loop on the needle. And then the yarn over and that twisted loop are then going to come off the needle on the next row, rather than coming off the needle as soon as you work it here. That's why they appear a row later. So here's that twisted loop, and I'm just going to purl it like I would normally. If I was working in the round, I would just knit it. Now when I come to the yarn over, you can see that it's angled to the left. I have to work it through the trailing leg, which is the leg furthest from the tip. So if it's left leaning, then I'm going to have that trailing leg is on the back of the needle, so I have to turn like this in order to get it. I can purl it. What I'm seeing with my twisted loops is that sometimes they're looser than others. It depends on how much I tighten it up. So I find that this one tends to have the most slack and it is the most enlarged. I find the one that I do with a yarn over, it seems to be more consistent in size with the stitches on either side. And I find that the make one increase that I do by lifting the loop tends to distort the stitches on either side a little more. It's borrowing some slack. And you can avoid that by working, with pointy tipped needles and being really careful and working close to the tip. But my preference is just to do the yarn over, and then I know that the stitches are going to be very similar in size. This is my preference. This isn't always the way I do things. I was just knitting these mittens. This is a free pattern from Purl Soho called Arched Mittens or Arched Gusset Mittens, something like that. On every single round, I had to do a make one increase. And the way I was doing them at first was with the yarn over, and then on the next round, I would do a yarn over and then work the previous yarn over through the back. And it was just too gappy. They were just too loose. And so I went back, I ripped it out, I started over, and I did a standard make one increase where I'm lifting the running thread. And I thought that that would distort this column of stitches, but it did not. So this is just a situation I'm not normally in. It's unusual. And in this case, it really served me well to switch which type of make one increase I used in the pattern. So it's good to know these different methods so that you can, if you're not getting the result that you would like, you can try one of the other ones and see if that improves things. So here I have an example of some pattern instructions where I'm starting with 12 stitches. And then there is an instruction to increase in that row. And I'm supposed to knit 3 and then do a make 1. And I repeat that until all the way across the row until there's 3 stitches left, and then I end with a knit 3. And in this case, the pattern is stating you will now have 15 stitches. A good pattern will tell you after an increase row how many stitches you're supposed to have, but not all patterns do. So if we want to lay it out so we can visually see what those would look like, we have 12 stitches here, and we're going to work across the stitches just like we're working across the needle from right to left. We're going to knit 3 stitches. We're going to do a make 1 increase, knit 3, make 1, knit 3, make 1. And then we can see, well, this is how we end up with 15 stitches because we're going to be able to increase 3 times. Well, now let's say we wanted to use a knit front back instead of a make 1 increase. We can't just follow the original instructions as they're written and substitute a knit front back for a make 1, because if we did that, here is what would happen to these 12 stitches. Here we would knit 3 and then we would do a knit front back. So we would knit in this stitch and then we would get the increase would occur after that 4th stitch. And then we would knit 3 more stitches and we would do a knit front back here. So then we would knit 3 stitches. But then what? We're supposed to repeat this action until there's 3 stitches left and then knit the final 3, but we've got 4 here. So we can either knit 3 and then do a knit front back, which gives us our 3 increases, but we don't have our additional 3 at the end. Or we would just knit those 4 stitches. We can't do what the original instructions say. We can't just swap out knit front back for make 1 and use those original instructions. So here's what we do instead. We know that we want an actual increase after every 3 stitches. So the actual increased stitch occurs after that. So we want it to occur here. So when we're doing a knit front back, in order to get that bump right here after the 3rd stitch, this is the stitch that has to be increased. So in this case, we rewrite our instructions so that we have knit 2, knit front back, and we're going to repeat that until we have 3 stitches remaining, and then we're going to do our final knit 3 stitches. So that's how you substitute it in this direction. And you can use this idea of drawing things out and then seeing where the actual increase occurs. And by the increase, it's that bar for the knit front back. You need to use this knit stitch to get that bar, but this is the placement of the increase. So if you were looking at these instructions and you wrote it out so you could see where the increase was, then when you wanted to switch it to a make 1, you would see that I have to knit 3 stitches and then I'm going to do my increase, because a make 1 increase occurs between 2 existing stitches. It doesn't use a live stitch on the needle in order to create it. What I've shown you today are different ways of getting to the same end point in knitting. Sometimes that end point is something that looks identical, but the path to get there is different. In other cases, the end point might simply be to increase a certain number of stitches with the same frequency, but to swap out the original technique with a different technique that you might like better. I'll put the full videos demonstrating individual techniques shown in this video down in the video description. If you have any comments or questions about this video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.